1955. The Ku Klux Klan has just finished their rally, and now they're doing what they've always done. Riding through black neighborhoods to terrorize families who've lived here for generations. The local police look the other way, while the government pretends it isn't happening. This was just another night in the segregated South, where wearing a white hood meant you could get away with murder. But in Monroe, something different was about to happen. Something that would shake the very foundation of how North Carolina, 1955. The Ku Klux Klan has just finished their rally, and now they're doing what they've always done. Riding the local police, while the government pretends it isn't happening. This was just another night in the segregated South, where wearing a white hood meant you could get away with murder. But in Monroe, something different was about to happen. Something that would shake the very foundation of how Black Americans fought for their rights. You see, while Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching nonviolence in Alabama, one man in Monroe looked at those burning crosses, those night riders terrorizing his community, and decided enough was enough. His name was Robert F. Williams, and his story isn't your typical civil rights tale. Robert was a Marine veteran who came home, looked at the terror in his community, and did something that nobody thought was possible at the time. He armed his people. He organized 60 men, trained them for self-defense, and famously stated, "Nowhere in the annals of history does the record show a people delivered from bondage by patience alone." Considered a hero to many, Robert's story all started with a simple question: what happens when the oppressed refuse to be victims of the system? Robert Franklin Williams was born on February 26, 1925, in a world shaped by the shadows of slavery. His grandparents, who had lived under the whip and chain, made sure he never forgot what that meant for him. Growing up in Monroe, their stories were filled with warnings about what could happen if Black people couldn't defend themselves. Robert witnessed this truth firsthand at age 11. When he saw a police officer brutally beat a Black woman on Monroe's main street, the officer dragged her bleeding body along the pavement to jail, leaving a trail of blood as her screams echoed across the street. It was a public spectacle meant to remind the Black community of their vulnerability and inferiority. That image would be burned in young Robert's mind forever. But Monroe in the 1930s wasn't much different from the world his grandparents knew. It may have been 70 years since the end of slavery, but the heavy chains of oppression weighed heavy in the air. It was still a prison for Black people, just with different chains. White-only signs were plastered across town, back doors and separate entrances for colored folks. Every sip from a segregated water fountain, every step off the sidewalk when whites passed by. These were the daily humiliations and reminders of a system designed to keep Black Americans in their place. But then came World War II, and like many young Black men in the South, Robert saw an opportunity to better his life up north, Detroit. The arsenal of democracy, a city where you could make real money working in the auto factories. But what he found there wasn't just a job, it was an education in resistance. 1943. The ongoing war had created fierce labor competition between white and Black Americans, both struggling to find ways to feed and support their families. Black workers had migrated north by the thousands, drawn by the promise of defense plant jobs, but Detroit wasn't ready. Housing was scarce, and Black families were crammed into small, overcrowded neighborhoods. White workers became fearful of the competition, so they staged walkouts when Black employees were promoted. In June of that year, white workers at Packard Plant, an automobile manufacturer in Detroit, shut down the entire production line to protest working alongside African Americans. Wow! These guys were serious about their racism. Detroit had quickly become a powder keg of racial tension. And when the spark finally lit, the city exploded into chaos. For 5 horrifying days, violence raged through the streets. Robert found himself caught in the middle of it all, watching as Black residents fought back against white mob violence in a desperate attempt to save themselves. 34 people died in those riots. 25 of them were Black. But something else was born in that fire. You see, an elephant raised into adulthood while chained to a chair will think that it cannot break free from its bondage. But we all know Mighty is the elephant. The scales had fallen from his eyes, and Robert realized that submission wasn't the only option. He could fight. Like many young black men of his generation, Robert was drafted into military service in 1944, but his experience would be different. He was assigned to the Marines, a branch that had only recently begun accepting African Americans. For a year and a half, Robert served as a private in the segregated Marines. This wasn't just military service. It was a reminder of the contradictions of fighting for democracy abroad while facing segregation in uniform. The discipline, tactical training, and organizational skills he learned in the Marines wouldn't go to waste. After the war ended and he returned home to Monroe, these same military experiences would shape his approach to defending his community. Robert wasn't alone. He was part of a generation of black veterans who returned home with the new skills and a deeper determination to fight for their rights. They had defended America abroad. Now they would defend their communities at home. But when Robert returned to Monroe in 1955, he found a town frozen in time. The same white-only signs, the same daily humiliations, the same terror from the Klan, except now, he was seeing it through different eyes, the eyes of a trained Marine who understood the power of violence, and he wasn't alone. In 1947, young Robert had married Mabel Robinson, just 16 years old, but already a fierce advocate for civil rights. Despite her youth, Mabel had already seen enough injustice to last a lifetime. She grew up watching her own community struggle against segregation, and unlike many young women of her era, she refused to accept it quietly. While most civil rights couples preached nonviolence, Robert and Mabel Williams believed in something else entirely: the right of armed self-defense. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, who became the faces of peaceful resistance, led dozens of nonviolent demonstrations across the South. Robert Williams had seen way too much to put their faiths in passive resistance alone. But how would this Marine veteran and his young wife transform from peaceful citizens into militant leaders of their community? And what would happen when their radical ideas clashed with the nonviolent mainstream of the civil rights movement? By the way, if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more videos about the heroes of Black history, please subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to us and helps us spread awareness about our fight for freedom. To understand what Robert was about to do, you need to understand what the NAACP was supposed to be. Founded in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People emerged in response to the lynchings and racial violence sweeping America. It was created by black and white progressives alike, aiming to fight discrimination through the courts and legislature. Their weapon of choice, however, were lawyers, not guns; respectability, not resistance. When Robert Williams returned home to Monroe after his time in Detroit and the Marines, he found a town frozen in time. With a population of just 12,000, Monroe had become a stronghold of white supremacy, home to an estimated 7,500 Klan members. Yes, you heard that right. Over half of the town's population were Klan members. Meanwhile, the local NAACP chapter was barely breathing. Like chapters across the country, they followed the national organization's preferred model, focusing on middle-class professionals like doctors, lawyers, and ministers. The kind of black folks who wouldn't scare racist white people. The kind who fought with briefs and motions. But Robert saw things differently. When he joined the Monroe NAACP chapter in 1955 and became its president the following year, he brought with him a radical new vision. The people who needed the NAACP most weren't in courtrooms or country clubs. He went to the textile mills, where black workers endured daily humiliation for poverty wages. He went to the farms, where families still worked land their grandparents had sharecropped. And most importantly, he went to the veterans, men who, like him, had fought fascism abroad, only to face it again at home. The results were transformative. Under Robert's leadership, membership expanded dramatically as working men and women with calloused hands and battle-hardened spirits joined the fight for their rights. And the first target was the public library, a taxpayer-funded institution that had shut its doors to black citizens. This wasn't just about books. It was about the fundamental right to access public resources that black taxpayers helped fund. The campaign succeeded. The library's doors were finally opened to all citizens of Monroe, regardless of color. It was a small victory, but a significant one. proving that organized resistance could crack the foundations of segregation. But as Robert and his followers would soon learn, some victories come with a violent backlash. In 1957, Robert led the fight to integrate Monroe's public swimming pool. The math was simple. Black taxpayers had helped pay for that pool, but their children couldn't swim in it. How absurd was that? Following the NAACP's traditional playbook, they started with peaceful demonstrations. NAACP members formed picket lines around the pool. But what happened next would change everything. The protesters were met with a hail of gunfire. White mobs opened fire on the picket lines, and despite law enforcement officers being present, not a single arrest was made. The message was clear. The law would not protect them.
There's no law here, and there's no need to take the white taxes to the courts because they will be freed, and that the federal government is not coming to the aid of people who are oppressed, and it is time for Negro men to stand up.
For Robert, this was the final straw. The swimming pool violence proved what he had long suspected, that legal briefs and peaceful protests alone wouldn't be enough in a town where the Klan operated with impunity. That's when Robert did something unprecedented. Drawing on his military experience and connections, he reached out to other Black veterans who understood both discipline and duty. These were men who had fought fascism in Europe and the Pacific, only to find it alive and well in their hometown. They trained in military tactics, they fortified their homes, and they made it crystal clear. Any Klan attack would be met with equal force. This came to a head in the summer of 1957 when rumors spread that the Klan planned to attack Dr. A. Elbert Perry, the NAACP's vice president. The Black Armed Guard fortified his house with sandbags. When the Klan opened fire from their cars, Robert's men returned fire, driving them away. The shooting made headlines, but the real story was what happened next. The same city officials who had always defended the Klan's constitutional right to organize suddenly changed their tune. Within days, they called an emergency session and passed a city ordinance that banned the Klan from Monroe without special permission from the police chief. For the Black community of Monroe, this was a turning point. Robert himself explained it best in his book, Negroes with Guns. Racists consider themselves superior beings and are not willing to exchange their superior lives for our inferior ones. They are most vicious and violent when they can practice violence with impunity. The ordinance requiring Klan gatherings to get police permission marked the first time the local government had ever restricted Klan activities in Monroe. The message was clear. Organized armed resistance had achieved what decades of peaceful petitions could not. But this success came at a price. The incident drew the attention of not just local authorities, but the FBI. Robert's insurance company canceled his car insurance, citing the frequent attacks on his vehicle. Even some of his allies began to worry that his methods might provoke even more violent retaliation. While Robert's armed defense strategy had gained the Black community some measure of protection, the deeper rot of racial injustice in Monroe was about to be exposed through the case of two young boys. It started innocently enough in October 1958. A group of children, both Black and white, were playing together in Monroe, the kind of scene that would raise no eyebrows in most places. During their game, a white girl gave two Black boys, 9-year-old James Thompson and 7-year-old David Simpson, an innocent peck on the cheek. What happened next would expose the brutal reality of Southern justice. The white girl's mother, upon hearing about the kiss, became enraged. Within hours, police dragged the two elementary school boys from their homes. They were charged with assault for receiving a kiss in a children's game. Let me remind you, the white girl is the one who gave the kiss. The local courts showed no mercy. These children, one just 7 years old, the other 9, were sentenced to reform school until they turned 21. In other words, a childhood game had earned them a 14-year sentence. The boys were beaten, and their parents weren't allowed to visit them for weeks. For Robert, this case crystallized everything wrong with the system. Guns could protect against the Klan, but what about the legal system itself? This time, he decided to fight fire with publicity. Robert launched a media campaign that would make Monroe front-page news across the globe. He contacted newspapers worldwide. He organized protests. He made sure everyone knew about two little boys torn from their families, beaten, and imprisoned, all for a childhood kiss. The international response was overwhelming. Civil rights activists across America rallied to the cause. European newspapers ran scathing editorials. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, spoke out against this travesty of justice. Under this intense global pressure, North Carolina's governor was forced to act. The boys were finally released and pardoned. But the state never apologized for its actions, and the incident revealed to the world the brutal injustice that black citizens of Monroe faced daily. The kissing case had exposed Monroe's racial injustice to the world, but it had also revealed something else: the power of Robert's increasingly militant approach to civil rights. Where traditional NAACP leaders might have quietly filed appeals, Robert had turned a local injustice into international news. For the NAACP's national leadership, this was the final straw. Robert's armed resistance against the Klan had already made them nervous. Now his aggressive media campaign and unapologetic rhetoric were drawing attention they didn't want. By 1959, the tension between Robert's militant approach and the NAACP's traditional strategy would reach a breaking point. A confrontation was coming that would force the entire civil rights movement to grapple with a crucial question. In the face of violent oppression, was nonviolence the only acceptable response? By 1959, Robert's confrontational approach had put him on a collision course with the NAACP's national leadership. When he publicly responded to a Monroe court's decision to acquit 2 white men of raping a pregnant black woman, his words would ignite a firestorm. Standing on the courthouse steps, Robert declared that if the courts wouldn't protect black citizens, they would have to protect themselves. The NAACP leadership, committed to their nonviolent approach, suspended him from his position. But Robert wasn't done. If anything, the split from the NAACP freed him to pursue even more militant strategies. Through 1960 and early 1961, the tensions in Monroe continued to simmer. By 1961, the law was clear, at least on paper. The Supreme Court had ruled segregation on interstate buses and terminals unconstitutional, first with Morgan versus Virginia in 1946, and again with Boynton versus Virginia in 1960. But across the American South, these federal rulings meant nothing without enforcement. In May 1961, an interracial group of activists decided to test these laws themselves. They called themselves the Freedom Riders, and their mission was deceptively simple: travel on interstate buses through the South, challenging the segregation that the Supreme Court had already declared illegal. The response was swift and brutal. In Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama, the Freedom Riders faced devastating violence. As law enforcement stood by watching, white mobs attacked the riders with shocking brutality. In Anniston, their bus was firebombed. In Birmingham, they were beaten as police conveniently disappeared for the first 15 minutes of the assault. Robert and MLK had long differed on tactics. While King preached nonviolence, Robert argued that triumph depended on the adversary. King acknowledged the advantages of armed self-defense, but maintained that nonviolence demanded greater self-control and courage. In May 1961, as Freedom Riders faced brutal violence across the South, Robert took a bold step. He sent King a direct telegram, challenging him to do more than lead from afar. No sincere leader asks his followers to make sacrifices that he himself will not endure. You are a phony. If you lack the courage, remove yourself from the vanguard. Now is the time for true leaders to take to the field of battle. If leaders believed in nonviolent resistance, they should physically participate with their fellow protesters on the front lines. 2 months later, when the Freedom Riders finally reached Monroe, they would find themselves caught between these two philosophies: nonviolent resistance and armed self-defense. And soon, they would need both. Drawing on his military experience and the discipline of the Black Armed Guard, Robert prepared for the riders' arrival. The stakes were clear. Monroe's Klan, over 7,000 strong in a town of just 12,000, had promised violence. The Freedom Riders came to Monroe determined to demonstrate the effectiveness of civil disobedience and challenge segregation laws, but they found something unprecedented: a black community ready not just to support them, but to defend them. For 2 weeks, the protests continued, but as hostile white observers gathered, the situation grew increasingly tense. The riders, recognizing the danger, called for the aid of the Black Armed Guard. Then, on August 27th, violence erupted. White supremacist mobs attacked the riders and caused chaos in the local neighborhood. In the midst of this turmoil, a white couple driving into the area found themselves caught in the chaos. What happened next would change everything. Robert, seeing the couple in danger, rescued them and brought them to his house for safety. But what he saw as an act of humanity, local authorities would twist into something far more sinister. What began as a Freedom Ride demonstration in Monroe quickly spiraled into chaos on August 27, 1961, as violence erupted throughout the local neighborhood. A white couple, Bruce and Mabel Stegall, drove their car into the midst of the turmoil. In a moment that would test Robert's principles, he faced a crucial choice. The crowd had recognized the Stegal's car, the same vehicle that had recently displayed hostile segregationist messages. But rather than allow any harm to come to them, Robert did something that defied the mob's expectations. He brought the couple into his home for protection. With the Stegalls safely inside, Robert tried to use this moment to help others in danger. He called Police Chief A.A. Monet, attempting to negotiate medical care for Freedom Riders who had been jailed and denied treatment. The response from Chief Monet chilled Robert to the bone. "You'll be hanging from the courthouse square in 30 minutes. This wasn't just a threat. In Monroe, it was a real possibility. White police authorities were already working to frame Robert's protection of the Stegalls as a kidnapping. Despite the fact that the couple never reported any abduction after leaving his house, the propaganda was already being made. Within hours, the situation had transformed. This wasn't just another confrontation with local authorities. The FBI issued a warrant in Charlotte, charging Robert with kidnapping, despite the fact that the Stegalls never reported any abduction after leaving his house. Facing false kidnapping charges and the very real threat of violence, Robert and his wife Mabel were forced to make an impossible decision. They fled Monroe, beginning a journey that would take them first to Cuba by way of Canada and Mexico. But exile didn't silence Robert. It amplified his voice. In Cuba, with Fidel Castro's approval and government assistance, he established Radio Free Dixie in 1962. This groundbreaking program, which aired in the US and Canada, combined jazz and blues with sharp commentary on the American government. That same year, Robert published his seminal work, Negroes with Guns. The book detailed his experiences with violent racism and laid out his fundamental disagreement with the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement. His words would later profoundly influence Huey P. Newton, founder of the Black Panther Party. After 5 years in Cuba, Robert's journey continued. He traveled throughout Asia and Africa, speaking out against racism, colonialism, and the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, he even met with revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh. From 1966 to 1969, Robert and his family lived in China, where he continued to publish his newsletter, The Crusader. His presence there deepened the connection between the Communist Party of China and the African-American revolutionary movement. In a historic moment, he received the honor of meeting with Mao Zedong, who issued statements supporting the African-American struggle against discrimination. By late 1969, Robert and Mabel returned to the United States, settling in Michigan. The kidnapping charges still loomed, but Michigan's Governor William G. Milliken refused to honor North Carolina's extradition request, noting that Robert couldn't receive a fair trial there. The legal shadow wouldn't lift until 1975, when Robert was finally able to face the charges. In January 1976, nearly 15 years after he fled Monroe, North Carolina prosecutors dismissed all charges against him, acknowledging their main witness was too weak to appear in court. Robert's story wasn't just about one man's fight for justice. It was about challenging the very framework of how civil rights could be won. At a time when nonviolence was considered the only acceptable path, he dared to argue for the fundamental right of self-defense. His influence would ripple through generations of civil rights activists, reshaping the movement in ways that would be felt long after his death in 1996. At his funeral, Rosa Parks delivered the eulogy, praising him for his courage and for his commitment to freedom. Her words captured what many had come to understand, that Robert F. Williams had forced America to confront difficult questions about resistance, self-defense, and the true meaning of civil rights. While Dr. King preached turning the other cheek, Robert showed there was another way. Not better, not worse, just different. A Marine veteran who understood that sometimes the only language oppressors understand is the language of force. He proved that armed resistance wasn't just about guns, it was about dignity. about standing up straight in a world trying to keep you on your knees. If you want to learn more about freedom fighters who stood up for Black justice, check out our video on Fred Hampton, the Black Messiah.
Because you couldn't get it together, sir. You got flip-flops with burnt-out soles from fleeing, sir. You can't give advice to nobody. All you need to do is sit down and listen and swat flies. We're not getting advice from a failure.
Bro, all
What does that
immigrants
mean?
are more
That's
successful than black people in their own country.
oh,
Come on, man.
stop. No, this stop. No, you're not, sir. You were a failure in your homeland and you're barely making ends meet here. You're not that successful, sir.
So you wouldn't be worried about immigrants if we weren't women.
Sir, no, I wouldn't.